I would like to welcome everybody to Drisha's Fall Programming and the third part of a series on the origins of Jewish academic studies by Dr. Chanan Gafni. And without further ado, Dr. Gafni.
Okay, so good evening. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to do a 2-minute or 1-minute review over what we've done in the first part of this mini series, and then immediately we'll proceed to the second part. Okay. So I'm just going to share. Okay, so in the first part of our series, we spoke mainly about theoretical aspects of modern Jewish studies. What I called here when, where, why, who. And if we want to be more specific, we spoke about themes that involve the definition of Wissenschaft, the term Wissenschaft ist Judentum Chochmat Israel, or the science of Judaism. We emphasized, or we tried to discuss the differences between traditional learning and critical scholarship. We devoted a little bit of time to the ideological and historical component in modern Jewish studies. We tried to show that these two, although they might seem a little bit contradictory, being critical, objective, and at the same time having your own ideological agenda, but nevertheless, these things went together. We spoke about the framework. How did Jews get exposed to critical studies? In what type of institutions did they operate? How did they publicize their ideas? And finally, we spoke about the way that Wissenschaft des Judentums, or Jewish studies, was perceived later on in the 20th century. How did 20th century scholars view this whole project called Wissenschaft des Judentums? So this is what we've done so far. So the first two sessions were more theoretical in their nature because we didn't really do any studying of their real work. We spoke about it, but not really, we didn't really view what they've done. So the second part of our session, here, I'll go back to this slide in a second. The second part of our mini-series will be devoted to the facts themselves, practice. What did they do and how did they approach various fields of Jewish studies or various themes in Jewish studies? How are we going to divide the second part of our series? So if you recall, one of the things we've emphasized in the first part of the series, when we were talking about the differences between traditional learning versus critical scholarship, so we saw that there are different conceptions that distinguish these two views. And we spoke about 4 important elements that I think are very crucial here. The first element, we spoke about the time factor. We saw that for traditional scholars in traditional learning, people avoid thinking about the time component. They want to think of their tradition as something static, something that does not change. Whereas among critical scholars, the dynamics are very crucial. They want to see how a tradition evolves, how does it change, what develops, or perhaps what gets distorted in the course of time. So the time factor is a very important element that kicks in only when you talk about critical scholarship. The second element we spoke about after time was the context. Traditional scholars want to think of their tradition as a sterile tradition, as if it's not operating in any context, as if Jews are just developing their culture or tradition isolated from their environment. Whereas critical scholars are actually very interested in learning about the context. They want to know, how did the Jewish culture influence, but also what did they also learn or accept from the surrounding environment. So the diffusion is also another factor. Time, context. The third one, the question how many Judaisms do we have? Traditional scholars want to think that there's only one form or one type of Judaism. They tend to harmonize all sorts of sources, whereas critical scholars are actually interested in finding different trends, learning about different views, more pluralistic in the way that they view their tradition. And finally, traditional scholars approach the text with faith. They trust what it says, whereas scholars claim to be objective and skeptical towards what they read. We were saying that all of these are perhaps rooted in the origin of this tradition. Because for traditional scholars, the tradition is perceived as divine, and if we perceive our tradition as something that comes from God, we don't want to allow any human involvement in that tradition. We don't want to think that it changed in the course of time, or it has some influences, or perhaps that there are different types of Judaism, because that basically means that there's a human element in this tradition. And we want to think that this is divine. That's the way traditional scholars perhaps view this. Whereas critical scholars tend to think that there's a crucial human element in the formation of this tradition. And that's why they're willing to hear or to take into account other ideas or include other concepts when they think about their tradition. So this is what we've done in the first unit. And the way I want to break the second part of our series is to devote four sessions. One of them I'll probably stretch, it will become 2, but the remaining sessions will have each class devoted to one theme that was studied, that emphasizing one of those elements. So we're going to have one session that will be devoted to the time factor. One session will be devoted to the variety factor. Third part will be devoted to the context, starting to include the context in which this tradition emerges. And finally, skepticism. Within each one of those, we'll focus on one theme. So today, our session will be devoted to the time factor, to the understanding that the tradition is something that is perhaps not necessarily stable or static, but rather there is some dynamics going on. And to be more specific, our theme will be devoted to the mysteries of the oral law. That's the particular theme of today's class. And we're starting to head with the sources themselves. So let's first ask, what is oral law? When people talk about oral law, Torah shebe'al peh, what is oral law? How would you define oral law? Anybody? Just give me 1 or 2 definitions, and then I'll try to. How would you define oral law? What is the oral law? What is
Mishnah and Gemara.
So you're referring to particular texts, but as an abstract idea, what is oral law? You're right. You're absolutely right.
I think what it is explained is that it's the oral law that God gave to Moses at the Sinai, and he transmitted orally, and then that was kept through generations, transmitted through generations until it was written.
Okay, both definitions are right. And the answer, and the reason that is because people usually refer to the concept of oral law in many different ways. Some are more restricted, thinking about particular texts such as Mishnah or Talmud, and other people will use Torah shebe'al peh or oral law to mean pretty much everything outside the Bible itself. We're not going to get into all of these nuances. We'll just, for our purposes, it's important to emphasize that the concept of oral law is an ancient concept, and we will refer to it in our particular session as the body of information in which we use in order that accompanies the written law and perhaps tells us how to apply it or how to understand it. So this is for our purposes. That will be the definition we're going to be talking about. And the oral law, the concept of Torah shebe'al peh, is a fairly ancient idea. It appears even before rabbinic literature, but of course, it's also very dominant in rabbinic literature itself. Let's just read one text that refers to the idea of oral law and even emphasizes the importance of that concept. So here we're reading in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Bavli, Tractate Shabbat 31a. Anybody wants to read? Okay, so I'll try to help you out. Yes, Judy?
I'll read.
Thank you. We have so many more texts to go, so you'll each have to do take some part. Yes, our rabbis taught.
Our rabbis taught a certain heathen once came before Shammai and asked him, "How many Torot have you?" "2," he replied, "the written Torah and the oral Torah." "I believe you with respect to the written, but not respect to the oral Torah. Make me a proselyte on condition that you teach me the written Torah only," in parentheses. But he scolded and repulsed him in anger. When he went before Hillel, he accepted him as a proselyte. On the first day, he taught him Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. The following day, he reversed them to him. "But yesterday you did not teach them to me thus," he protested. "Must you then not rely on me? Then rely upon me with respect to the oral Torah 2.
Okay, so this is a very nice legend, and we'll get back to this idea later on. It just emphasizes the important role of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of oral law, in the Jewish tradition. It's equivalent in its importance to the written law. Perhaps it accompanies it, and you can't study one without the other. The theme we're going to talk about, we're going to have two themes that we're going to discuss today in our class. Two questions that involve the Torah Sheba'al Peh, or two important mysteries that surround this idea. We are going to avoid talking about the question, where does the Torah Sheba'al Peh come from? What's the origin of Torah Sheba'al Peh? It's a very crucial question. We're going to avoid that one. We're going to talk about two other questions that are going to be the center of our discussion today. The first one is a theoretical question that we will try to discuss. Why is there a need for oral law? Why was the entire tradition not documented in writing from the very start? So the first question we will try to discuss in today's class is, how did people understand the whole need for an oral tradition? Why is it not enough just to have the entire tradition put into writing? Wouldn't that be an ideal way of transmitting the tradition so that everything is included in the written text? Why have this separation of two types of tradition, regardless again of its origin? So that's one question that we're going to discuss today. And the second one is historical in its nature. When did the sages allow writing the oral law? And what were the circumstances? Charlene was already hinting that at some point, this tradition was put into writing. The Mishnah and the Talmud that Lizzie, you mentioned before, are already in the library. They're written books now. So the second question we will try to understand is, when did this shift take place? When did people start writing the Torah Sheba'al Peh?
Common era.
So we're going to have to talk about this. It's not so simple, not so simple. Now, the goal of our discussion today is not really about the truth. We're not interested in the truth. We don't really want to know why is there a concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh? Why is there an oral law? We're not really concerned with that. And we're not even concerned with the questions, when did people put the Torah Sheba'al Peh into writing, the oral law into writing? What our main interest is, how did scholars view these questions throughout history? How did scholars approach these two mysteries in the course of Jewish history? Because I think that this is a very good demonstration that shows the differences in approach between traditional and critical scholars. So again, our goal is not really to decipher those mysteries and to know the truth about this, but more to see the different perspectives. How do modern scholars view questions rather differently than the way that people study these or view these elements in the past, or these ideas in the past? But we will say a few words at least about rabbinic literature itself before we approach medieval scholars and modern scholars and distinguish between them. I do want to say a few words about rabbinic literature that involves these questions as well. Here you have two demonstrations that talk about these, that kind of also maybe give you a sense of the problems we're going to talk about. The first one is about the theoretical question. That's the first thing we're going to discuss, right? Why bother having an oral tradition? Isn't written tradition always better? So that's the first theme we're going to talk about. And the second theme we're going to talk about involves the history. When did the oral law become a written law? When did people start writing the tradition? So here we're more interested in the historical aspect. Okay, so two themes. And we're starting, as I said, with the theoretical part. And I do want to read with you a few rabbinic texts, at least, that will start from which we'll start our journey. In rabbinic literature, we find here and there that the rabbis are addressing these questions. The rabbis do try to tell us something about this. It starts, perhaps the most explicit reference to this question appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Gittin 60b. And the Talmud over there is referring to a verse in Exodus 34:27. In Hebrew, it reads, Ktov lecha et hadvarim ha'ele. Moshe is commanded to write the following words, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ele karati itcha brit ve'et Israel. Because due to these words, or based upon these words, the covenant was established with the people of Israel. So the rabbis say, referring to this tradition, Rabbi Judah ben Nachmani, the public orator of Rabbi Simon ben Lakish, discoursed as follows. On the one hand, it is written, write thou these words, Ktov lecha, and it is also written, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'eleh, for according to the mouth of these things. He's emphasizing the word al pi, which means something oral. What are we to make of this? Is it something written or is it something oral? It means the words which are written, they are not at liberty to say by heart, and the words transmitted orally, they are not at liberty to recite them from writing. So here we have one example where the rabbis make it very clear. We have two types of traditions, and each one is supposed to maintain in the same form. We're not supposed to mix between a written and an oral traditions. Each one is supposed to be maintained in its own unique way. But this text, for example, does not really tell us what. What's still missing here?
What's the difference between them?
What's the difference and why is it so? Right. Why do we need to keep this distinction going on? Why can't we mix between these two types of traditions? Why can't we write the oral law? So I'm turning into one additional text here, and this is a short passage in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Eruvin. And here it's referring to a verse in Kohelet. Let's see what it says here. Who wants to read? You should grab the short ones. In case, who's reading? Somebody wants to read? Yes. No, we didn't read. Yeah, we didn't hear it. So I'll read it here. In case you should object, if these are of real value, if you think that the oral law is of real value, why were they not recorded in the Torah? Answers this text. Scripture stated, of making many books, there is no end. In Kohelet, it talks about, in the very end of Kohelet, it says, V'yoter mehem abnihi zaher, beyond everything you should be careful. You shall not make too many books. Of making many books, there is no end. Here too, the rabbis are addressing the same theme. Why not put everything into writing? And they're bringing a biblical verse as a response. And here too, we're a little bit left out, puzzled. But why are we not supposed to have more books? What's the point of stopping us from recording the entire tradition? So the two most important places in rabbinic literature where they emphasize the fact that the oral law is supposed to remain oral and not written, they're only relying on verses. They're only referring to biblical verses, but they're not really telling us why. Finally, this is a very famous text that we're going to conclude our first part. There's one tradition in rabbinic literature where they do give us perhaps a sense. Why is it so? Why was the oral law not committed to writing? And here it goes as follows. Sarah, you want to read?
Absolutely.
Rabbi Judah.
Sure. Rabbi Judah, the son of Shallum, was of the opinion that when the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, write thou, Moses wanted to write the Mishnah as well. However, the Holy One, blessed be he, foresaw that ultimately the nations of the world would translate the Torah into the Greek language and would claim, we are the Israelites. Now the scales are balanced as to who are his people. The Holy One, blessed be he, can say to the nations of the world, you claim that you are my children, but I know that only those who know my secrets are my children. Where are his secrets to be found? In the Mishnah, which was given orally and from which everything can be derived.
Okay, we can stop. We can stop here. So here, I think we hear of a legend. This is a legend. Moses wants to have the Mishnah put into writing. He wants to have the oral law also be included as part of the Torah. And God says it's a terrible idea. And I want you to tell me, based on this tradition is different than the previous two sources that we've seen, because it doesn't just give us a source, a biblical source for this prohibition of putting the oral law into writing, but it actually gives us some sort of explanation. And what type of explanation is given here? Why does this tradition assume we're not supposed to allow the oral law to be put into writing? Why did God not allow Moses to write the Mishnah as well?
It would get out to the rest of the world, who would then take it and say that they're the people who it was written for.
Exactly. So here we have a historical, I think, important message here. When texts are open, are put in, or accessible to anybody, you lose control over these texts. This is essentially what this tradition is telling us. And this is also the case with the oral law. Moses wants to have the oral law put into writing, and God tells him, look, it doesn't really work well. Just see what happened to the written law. As soon as it was translated into Greek, what is this? It's probably referring to the Septuagint. And then every other nation can take over this text and say this text is really about us. It's referring to us. This is something we want to avoid. And for this same reason, God says, do not put the Mishnah into writing. Don't put the Mishnah on the web. As soon as you allow it, as soon as you let it circulate, there's no control over this text anymore. This is one place where the rabbis are indeed giving us a sense. Why did oral law remain oral? And many scholars assume that this is here hinting to who are those people who are claiming we are the true Israelites. I think it's pretty clear what is this a reference to? Who is this referring to? Who are the people who took over the Bible and said the Bible is about us? We are the true Israelites.
The Christians.
Right. It's obviously influenced by the rise of Christianity. Christians took over the Bible, and God says we don't want the same thing to happen with the oral law. And this is what the rabbis say about the conception of oral law, and not much more beyond that. I brought this just as background because our main interest is to see what happens. How do people treat the oral law in the medieval period and later on in the modern period? And here's the crucial. So now we're really entering the core of today's discussion. In the Middle Ages, there were many theories, new revolutionary theories, I would say, that address the same issue, the same mystery. Why not allow the oral law to be put into writing? Why is there a need for an oral tradition along with the written tradition? Unlike the rabbis, who are just happy with reciting verses or perhaps referring to the historical context, medieval scholars think about it more philosophically. They try to think about the philosophy of an oral tradition. Why is there a need for an oral tradition? And there are many theories that circulated in the medieval period about the conception of oral law. But there was one governing approach that perhaps was the most dominant. And I want to show you a few sources in which this theory appears. The first one, obviously Maimonides, where we're going to refer to a passage from the guide where he talks about the oral law, the traditional law, referring to the oral law, and he explains why did it have to stay in an oral manner rather than a written manner. Again, I need a volunteer. Arlene, you want to read? No? So who wants to read this?
I will.
Okay, great.
Okay. Even the traditional law, as you're well aware, was not originally committed to writing. With reference to the law, this rule was very opportune, for while it remained in force, it averted the evils which happened subsequently: great diversity of opinion, doubts as to the meaning of written words, slips of the pen, dissensions among the people, formation of new sects, and confused notions about particular subjects.
Okay,
now,
so I want
can I just ask something? I was reading about Spain, about medieval Spain, before 1492, where everyone kind of lived peacefully, quote unquote, underneath Islam. It was an age of so-called enlightenment, but yet there were disputations, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
And that was because they seem to be, it's almost irrational, and you really can't help but think of anti-Semitism. And there was this big disputation where there's an argument in front of the king where someone who had converted to Catholicism from Judaism, who was a scholar in his own right, tried to beat back and beat down, was it Rumba? Who was it that he had?
We're not going to be able to deal with anti-Semitism. We're not going to solve anti-Semitism today.
But what I'm saying is, I would guess that would be one of the reasons too.
Okay, so first, before we try to look for the historical context of Maimonides, I want first to articulate what is he saying here about the nature of oral text in contrast to written texts. He's saying something that is not obvious, and what is he saying here? I think what Maimonides is saying, and yes.
Well, that once you make a mistake in writing, it's very hard to take it back. That's one thing, right?
But I think you're absolutely right. But I think he's saying not just when you make mistakes. I think what Maimonides is saying, basically, a written text can bear many, many interpretations and many meanings. The written text is not something that is absolutely clear cut. It allows various ways of approaching it and interpreting it and understanding it. That's why written texts have a very important, big limitation by definition. And what Maimonides is saying is, for that purpose, God wanted to have an oral tradition that accompanies that written text, because through oral tradition, things become clear cut. Why is that? Let's just explain a little bit. Why is that? Why does an oral tradition help us decipher and make things more clear and defined?
It's hard to vary. You have to memorize.
It's not just about memorizing, I think. It's also about teaching. Look, you took this course in Drisha, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you just read in my articles? I don't have so many articles, but why didn't you just read my book? Because you want to see my face, because you want to see how I explain things, because you want to get the nuances. There's some things that you can explain much better through when you look at somebody's face, when you hear the connotation of ideas, when you hear the nuances. That's why we go to school. That's why we don't just read books all day long, because books are kind of cold and not clear. And if you want to get the feeling for a text, if you want to you get all the tiniest details, it has to be done through a real teacher. This is also an advertisement for Drisha, by the way. I'm just kidding. So this is essentially what Maimonides is saying, but he was not the only one who was following this direction. Let's look at Rabbi Judah Halevi in his Kuzarim. I don't need to talk about him. You all know of him. So what does he say? In one of the texts, when the rabbi is referring to the concept of oral law, and he says the following words. He wants to say the following words. The rabbi. Yes,
faculty of speech is, I'll do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
The faculty of speech is to transmit the idea of the speaker into the soul of the hearer. Such intention, however, can only be carried out to perfection by means of oral communication. This is better than writing. The proverb is, from the mouths of scholars, but not from the mouth of books. Verbal communication finds various aids either in pausing or continuing to speak according to the requirements of the sentence, by raising or lowering the voice, in expressing astonishment.
Great. You read it so nicely, and your way of reading it is a good demonstration why it's important to hear texts and not just to read them. This is exactly what Rabbi Judah Halevi is saying. If you don't hear the text, if you just read it, it's not the same thing. If you want to understand precisely what the text means, you have to have somebody who guides you, somebody who reads the texts for you and explains. He's essentially talking about body language, right? Talking about what accompanies tradition, this tradition. In Hebrew, the sentence here, from the mouth of scholars, but not from the mouth of books. In Hebrew, it's mipi sofrim velo mipi sfarim. It was a very common sentence that you find all over in medieval literature. You'd rather study with scholars rather than books. Mipi sofrim, people and not texts. This is Rabbi Judah Halevi, and the idea is the same. Texts are open to debates. They're not clear-cut. Teachers, oral tradition makes things much more clear. One last text, fairly long text. Sarah, I can't ask any other participants to read this. It's going to be you. This is from Rabbi Joseph Albo in his book called Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of the Principles, and he too addresses the same theme. And he goes on and explains it. Let's see what he sees. A thing is perfect.
A thing is perfect if we cannot conceive it to receive addition or diminution. Now, since David characterizes the Torah as perfect, it follows that it cannot in any respect be deficient in the realization of its purpose. Now, every written document of whatever nature it be can be understood in two different ways, one of which corresponds to the intention of the writer and the other is very far from it.
Skip 4 lines. For this reason,
Okay. For this reason, it was necessary in order that the divine Torah should be perfect and should be understood in the correct way, that when God gave the Torah to Moses in writing, he should explain it to him in the proper manner. Similarly, Moses explained it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and so on, and so from generation to generation, so that there should be no doubt in the correct meaning of the written document.
one more. This interpretation. Sorry.
This interpretation of the written law, which Moses transmitted to Joshua and Joshua to his successors, is called the oral law, because this interpretation cannot be in writing, else the same uncertainty of which we spoke would attach to this writing as to the first, and we should require an interpretation of the interpretation, and so on without end.
Okay, so I think what he says is, again, the same basic idea. Written texts can bear different meanings, whereas an oral tradition maintains the same. And if this is true, so what is the essence of oral law? What is the essence of an oral tradition? Basically what it means, this is an attempt to make sure, to secure the tradition, to make sure that this tradition is transmitted in the most accurate and precise way. We do not want people starting to fight over the meaning of these traditions. We don't want people to have arguments as to what did God mean when he gave his law. And the accompanying tradition is what secures or guarantees that.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Okay, but on the other hand, with oral tradition, and which is in many, many cultures, storytelling, from generation to generation, what you hear is dependent upon the storyteller, right? And that is not right. And that is
we're going to address what you're saying in a minute, okay? So
all right.
You're pointing out something very important. We'll get there soon, okay? We'll just do this by order. You're absolutely right about what you're saying. We'll get this there in a second. So far what we're talking about, and this is the governing approach in medieval period, oral tradition equals a tradition that maintains most accurately, because through oral speech, one gets the precise nuances of that tradition. This is what medieval scholars tend to believe. Why did they say whatever they were saying? What was the circumstances, or what were the inspiration for saying this? So scholars pointed out or go in different directions. Some scholars assume that this is what Maimonides was saying, for instance, is responding to the reality of his own time. Many debates, many arguments, controversies among scholars, rabbinic law is becoming much more sophisticated and complicated. Various legal codex are being put. He felt that this is getting out of control. And when Maimonides is in essence saying, if we were smart enough and we did not put this into writing, perhaps we would have avoided this terrible mess in our tradition. So this is one way of looking at it. Other people suggested that perhaps there's also some external inspiration here. Mainly people refer to a text that appears in Plato. In one of his books, he addresses the question of the invention of writing. This is a dialogue between two people there. One person praises and thinks that this is the most important invention ever, inventing the concept of writing. And Socrates is actually arguing with that. And he says the following words. Who's reading? Writing, Phaedros.
Writing, Phaedros, has this strange quality and is very like painting. For the creatures of painting stand like living beings. But if one asks them a question, they preserve a solemn silence. And so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence, but if you question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. And every word, when once it is written, is bandied about, alike among those who understand and those who have no interest in it. And it knows not to whom to speak or not to speak. When ill-treated or unjustly reviled, it always needs its father to help it, for it has no power to protect or help itself.
Okay, this is a beautiful text, I think. And what Plato is in essence saying, a written text that appears like the best form of transferring or transmitting a certain idea, but it's actually misleading. At first glance, you think you get the full picture, but whenever you have a dilemma or a question, what does he say? Its father is not there to help. What's the father of the painting or of the text?
The author.
The author. But the author doesn't, when you buy a book, the author doesn't come along with the book. You're left with the text on your own. And if there's any questions, you're just left to struggle with that on your own. So some people say that perhaps this could have been some of the part of the inspiration that led Maimonides to say what he says. But for our purposes, I think what's very crucial is to emphasize medieval scholars think oral law means a secure tradition. Oral law was the tool or the means for making sure this tradition remains precisely authentic, precisely the way that it was handed from the very start. What's going to happen now? I'm going to skip the next slide. We don't have enough time. What's going to happen when we move to the modern period? We're going to see a great, huge revolution or a huge shift in the way that people understand oral law. If I asked you this at the beginning of class, I'm sure you would have spoken in modern terms, and you would view oral tradition drastically different. The first place where I encountered this new view of oral law is in a text written by Mordechai Gimpel Schnaber Levison. I don't know how you had so many names. A book called Ma'amar HaTorah VeHaChochma, a book about the Torah on the one hand, but also Chochma. Here, it's a book that deals with Jewish tradition, but also modern science. It was put up in London in 1771, although the author of this text was actually born in Germany. He studied medicine. He also practiced medicine. But at some point, he was actually accused of some murder of one of his patients, and he had to escape to London, a huge mess. Let's not get there. We're just going to read one passage of his text. He was a student of Rabbi David Frankel, if you heard of him. He was also the teacher of another important rabbi that we're going to talk about in a second. And he writes a book called Ma'amar HaTorah VeHaChochma, as I said a minute ago. And in this text, he says the following words. The book was in Hebrew, so I'm going to read first the passage in Hebrew, and then you'll read it in English for me. He says as follows, אם הייתה גם התורה שבעל פה בכתב, כבר יימנע מהחכמים לחדש דבר. וגם ההמוניים לא היו מקבלים גזירותם, זולת הכתוב. לזה נמסר לחכמים פירושי המצוות והסתעפות הדינים ומוצאיהם, ויהיה בכוחם זה לעשות גזירות וסייגים, כפי מה שיגזור הזמן והמקום. Now let's read it in English to make it clear, so it doesn't sound like awkward Hebrew. He says that as follows, if the oral law had been in writing, the rabbis would have not been able to make any innovations, and also the masses would not have accepted their decrees, relying instead only on what is written. I think when you read these words, what you find here is precisely the opposite of what we've seen in the medieval period. For medieval scholars, a written text is vague, is unclear. And the reason we need an oral tradition is to make this text clear so that it captures the essence of that text, the authentic meaning of that text. What this scholar, German scholar, writes is exactly the opposite. What he assumes is that a written text is very clear. As a matter of fact, it's too clear, it's too clear cut that it doesn't allow any room for any flexibility. Our tradition needs to have something vague, something that this, zone that nobody really knows what it says, something blurry about it. You'll never be able to adopt your tradition to your own circumstances or to your own needs unless you allow some room for flexibility, for change. And for that reason, there was a need to have one part of the tradition put in writing, but the other part was this thing that only rabbis deal with, the oral law. They can basically suggest or use the conception of oral law to manipulate the written text, to push it or to adapt it to whatever needs and circumstances that they feel time requires or their place requires. This is precisely the opposite meaning of Torah Sheba'al Peh, or the contradictory approach to the Torah Sheba'al Peh that we find in the modern period, in the end of the 18th century period. 180 degrees different than what we saw in medieval literature. He's the first person who comes up with this idea, and right afterwards it becomes the prevailing understanding of oral law from here on. The Jewish scholars that perhaps made this more famous or more popular is Schnabel Levisen's close friend. They were born together and lived together for several years in Berlin. And you know this guy?
Yeah.
Moses Mendelssohn. So he articulates the same thing just a few years later in 1783. And look what he says. This is in his book called Jerusalem, or probably he pronounced it Jerusalem. In German, you don't pronounce the J, Jerusalem. So this is what he's writing in his book. I'm not going to get into the entire context of this book, but let's just see one passage where he refers to the conception of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this is what he says. In German, people have very long sentences. Sometimes you don't know where the sentence starts, but you don't know where it ends. So this is the case here as well. So let's try to read this and see what he says. Doctrines and laws. Who's reading? Who wants to read? We don't have so many more texts left, so just grab your opportunities. Yes.
Doctrines and laws were not connected to...
We don't hear so well.
Doctrines and laws were not connected to words or written characters, which always remain the same for all men and all times, amid all the revolutions of language, morals, manners, and conditions. They were entrusted to the living, spiritual instruction, which can keep pace with all changes of time and circumstance, and can be varied and fashioned according to the pupil's needs, ability, and power of comprehension. It was at first expressly forbidden to write more about the law than God had caused Moses to record for the nation.
Okay, excellent. This is what Mendelssohn is saying, and you see the resemblance, the same precise idea. Oral law was not meant to be put into writing because that would mean it remains exactly the same throughout history. It does not allow the rabbis to make any changes in that tradition. It does not leave room for any adaptation of that tradition into various conditions. And therefore, it was meant to have been left as an oral tradition. Mendelssohn and also Schnabel Levisohn were not thinking about this in practical terms. At this point, it's only a theoretical revolution, a new conception of Torah Sheba'al Peh, a new way of viewing oral law. And I think what's the crucial element for our purposes, you see what happened here? What factor started playing an important role in the way that people perceive Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral law? Which conception starts to kick in? I think the answer is the word.
The idea that the oral law not being written takes a different attitude. You have a different attitude towards it, and you can, in your further writing or talking about it as time goes on, have it directed to what concerns your time and in your
Exactly. You said the right word there. You included in your sentence the word time. The time factor starts playing a role. We see that people suddenly think about a tradition as something that is being influenced by time. It's not a stable, static tradition. It allows change. And they're not even talking about a particular specific law. They're talking about the whole frame. This is how our tradition is meant to be. It was meant to allow changes. Mendelssohn and also Schnabel Levisohn were not thinking about this in practical terms. Both of them were not preaching for reforms in Jewish law. They're speaking about this theoretically, but you can just guess what will happen just a few years later when we turn to the 19th century. The reform movement and reform trends are starting to emerge, and this will become the basic ideology or the justification for allowing changes in Jewish law, because this is what oral law is all about. You see this in the writings of one of the first reform rabbis. He was not a reform rabbi by definition. That was not his title. But in retrospect, he was one of the first reform rabbis, Rabbi Aaron Chorin. We're not going to talk about his entire story. But he also says, I'm not going to translate this. I'm not going to read the translation. I'll translate it simultaneously. He says, if the entire law with its interpretation was given from the very beginning into writing, that would not allow the rabbis of each generation to change things. Now, Rabbi Aharon Chorin is not talking about this in theoretical terms. He's already preaching for changes in Jewish law. Later on, in one second, in the 1840s, 1844, 45, and 46, there were 3 rabbinical assemblies in which Reform rabbis gather and try to articulate what's their agenda or what's their view about the future of Jewish law. Rabbi Leopold Stein, who was a rabbi in Frankfurt, says the following words: "For me, the relationship between the written and the oral law is the same as that between the letter and word. The letter exists and the word flourishes. The letter is rigid and the word is vital. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. And taken together, they prevent religion life from dissolution on the one hand and from stagnation on the other." This is already becoming a crucial ideological component. So look what we've done so far. And this is what I was trying to learn in today's lecture. You see the 2 important elements in Wissenschaft des Judentum already very clear or straightforward. On the one hand, people are starting to view the tradition in critical ways. They're not thinking about this necessarily as something that we're supposed to keep and maintain, but rather we're willing to allow the time factor to play a role. That's on the one hand, but at the same time, it's also very much influenced by people's ideology. Rabbis and scholars it's very important for many of them to present the Jewish tradition in such a manner because they know that this is what will allow them to make changes in Jewish law. What's interesting to see is that not only liberal rabbis come up with this theory, but eventually becomes something that almost all Jews share. And that's what I said to you. If I would ask you at the beginning of class, what do you think about oral law? Or why do you suppose there's a need for an oral law? I imagine that some of you at least would say, this is the mean of having our tradition become something more dynamic, or that's what allows our tradition to be a living tradition. And this is indeed what happens. Even rabbis who are not invested in reforms eventually accept this theory. One of them, the most famous one in this realm, was Samuel David Luzzatto, the Italian scholar from Padua. And he repeats this 100 times in his letters. He wrote 3 autobiographies, by the way. And in each one of them, this is a central theme. The oral law was meant to allow people to change their tradition. Look what he says here. This is one paragraph from one of his letters in 1865. And he's already not a reform rabbi, what we would call something conservative or more or less, and he's not trying to change Jewish law, but he still says, to this day, who's reading Israel's enemies in the second part in the English translation, to this day, nobody's reading, so it's Sarah. Okay.
My pleasure. To this day, Israel's enemies constantly mock us with passages drawn from various places in the Talmud, and those who attempt to refute them can do nothing. While the true answer is thus: the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud made many statements that were appropriate for the context in which they made them. It never occurred to them that everything they said would be committed to writing, for they were truly wise and did not put their words in writing, so leaders of future generations might fix and change them according to the needs of changing times and places.
So here too, you see oral traditions means allowing the tradition to change. You leave things orally because you want to allow changes. What's also striking in Luzzatto's statement here is the way he addresses what non-Jews say about our tradition. And it's fascinating to compare this to the Midrash that we read at the beginning of class. In the earlier part of today's class, we saw that the Midrash says the reason why we wanted to maintain our tradition orally is so that non-Jews are not exposed to it. It's our, this is our present. This is the present we got from God, and we don't want to share it with anybody else. So let's leave it orally. What Luzzatto says here is precisely the opposite. He says, sometimes we're actually embarrassed of this tradition, and we would have been better off if we kept this orally, because it was not meant to remain forever. Since we wrote it, now everybody mocks us. He's kind of embarrassed of the Jewish tradition rather than being proud of it. I want to conclude our discussion, since we're running out of time, and address the second part of our, the second theme. I'm skipping it a little bit. And that's the history of oral tradition. Because I told you, I promised you that we're going to talk mainly about the theoretical conception of oral law, but also the historical element. When did the oral law, when was it put into writing? When did this change take place? Because we obviously know that there's no more oral tradition. And here too, we see how critical scholars change their view. And it's clear that it's also due to their ideological concerns. In the medieval period, there was and again, I'm not interested in this addressing here who's right and who's wrong. We're more interested in how did people approach these questions. In the medieval period, the governing approach is what one of you said at the beginning. Who wrote the Mishnah? When was the Mishnah put into writing? What century?
200 of the Common Era.
Right, that's where I grew up in school. That's what people told me. Rabbi Judah the Prince, when he composed the Mishnah, it was also putting it into writing. It's one thing that, two things at the same time. He wrote, he composed the Mishnah and also put it into writing. This is the medieval governing approach, although you should know it's not the only approach. Rashi, for instance, thought that the oral tradition was only put into writing much, much later. But the governing approach was that it was something that was done at the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince. This is indeed the way that Maimonides talks about the Mishnah. In his introduction to the Mishnah, Maimonides says, speaking about the Rabbi Judah the Prince, and he said, when he describes what he did, he says he compiled the Mishnah, but also he says at the end, copies of it were made and widely disseminated. In other words, they were also circulating after his time. So we see that most scholars thought that it was Rabbi Judah the Prince, 2nd century, that puts the Mishnah into writing. Not just composing the text, but also puts it into writing. When we move to the modern times, we see that this drastically changes. This drastically changes, and people they bring up this question again, and new ideas emerge. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because as soon as we understand that oral law means the flexibility of the law rather than the way we maintain or secure the law, it was very crucial to understand, so who is that person who destroyed our tradition? Our tradition was meant to be a vital, flexible tradition. Who is responsible for this? Who distorted this beautiful idea of having a living tradition and made it into something that is frozen? And suddenly Maimonides' approach is not so obvious anymore. Do we really want to think that so early on in Jewish history, everything became static by putting everything into writing? Perhaps we prefer to think that a lot of this tradition remained vital for centuries on. And perhaps we're not necessarily obligated for every statement that appears in the Mishnah and the Talmud, because it was never meant to remain the same. It was meant to be something dynamic. So in the 19th century, you actually see various approaches on this matter. Sarah, I know 5 minutes left.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, I know. I saw it. I looked at you and I knew that's the next sentence. I'm totally aware of that. Usually I'm good with time. I still need to see you to remember that I have 5 minutes left. Okay, so when you approach the modern times, you see that suddenly this becomes an open question. Scholars who were not feeling concerned about rabbinic literature, they are willing to abandon this entire tradition. They didn't care saying that the rabbis put everything into writing. They didn't like the rabbis, and they didn't mind mocking them for putting everything in making everything into a textual tradition. But at least people who care for the tradition suddenly have other views of this matter. And especially, again, I mentioned before, Luzzatto, the Italian scholar, he emphasizes again and again and again, it's crucial to know Rabbi Judah the Prince was not the person who put the Mishnah into writing. Even the Amoraim, the Talmudic sages, were not the ones who put it into writing, but rather it was done much later, perhaps the year 800 or 900 CE, 700 years later than this 200 years that we grew up in school. Luzzatto says in one place, if people could only understand that our sages did not write down as much as one page, but their disciples preserved in their memory every word, every scrap of conversation they heard from their mentors, because they believed that everything uttered, even controversially, deserves preservation, and that only after some generations had passed and everything was written down, if all this could be understood, the Mishnah and the Talmud would be regarded in a different light. It's crucial for Luzzatto to ascribe a much later period for the writing, for the documenting of our tradition. In another place, he says, this is the actual letter where it's quoted from, he says, Kol od lo yuvan, as long as people don't understand, ki haTorah shebe'al peh, that the oral law, lo nichteva, ad shnat 500 leminyanam, if people are not willing to accept that the oral law was not put into writing before the year 500, lo yeh or bechokhmat Israel, there will be no light in Jewish studies. This was just a taste, what we've done today. We were trying to address one theme, try to see how the time factor starts kicking in. And we did that through examining the concept, through the idea of oral law. And we saw two things. That was the main message of today's class. On the one hand, a critical mode of thinking, allowing the conception of change, of dynamics in a tradition. We're not thinking about us as people who are just transmitting a tradition. We understand something went on, there's dynamics here. But at the same time, how can you miss the ideological tone here? It's clearly also influenced by ideology. And it seemed like it worked for them. They're not feeling embarrassed to say, we must emphasize that this is what oral law is about. We must give it a later, we must assume that this change happened later on, because this is what will suit our view of our Jewish tradition in a better, or presented in a better light. Side point, and I'm done. Scholars today actually believe that the Torah Shebe'al Peh, that the oral law, was only put into writing at some time at the period of the Geonim. In other words, 800 or 900 CE. So the approach that Uterature presents is actually very common even nowadays. It's not something that only belongs to the 19th century, but for various reasons, not necessarily for the same reasons that Uterature felt the need to say that. Okay, so I think this is the end of today's class. Next week, we're going to talk about the variety of traditions, not just having one type of tradition or one Judaism, but rather allowing many, many forms, many, many voices within our tradition. So that's going to be the theme of next week. And we're going to choose at least one, again, test case or a case study where we can examine that. Okay.
Can I raise a quick
good evening
question from the Facebook chat
yes.
for you? So
Yes.
Dana Hollander asked, are there any impacts of Protestantism on Stein's remark of the written letter versus the spoken word?
Of course, this is clearly what Paul is saying in the New Testament, talking about stones and right. It's clear, but at the same time, he does not address the Christian context of this. The question to what extent it's influenced by Christian dogma is a good question, but it needs to be put in a much larger context. He does not refer to this, but it's clearly alluding to that as well. So I agree with this comment. It's a very good comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for joining us. I do want to give a quick plug for continued fall programming from Drisha tonight at 8 p.m. by Rabbi David Silber, a class on imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud. And again, there are many, many more classes. So please go to our website at www.drisha.org/classes. And you can find all of the course descriptions and the registration links. So thank you again to Dr. Gafni and to everyone who joined us. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.